So hello, everyone. My name is Mohammed. I am the Vice President Finance of the Quebec Studies Student Association. So welcome to our Montreal as Seen by event series, which is jointly organized by the Quebec Studies Student Association, the Quebec Studies Program, the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Montreal, and the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. Today in our series, we welcome Samantha Reusch. If I'm pronouncing that right, Reusch, I should have asked before, right? Samantha Reusch, the Executive Director of Apathy is Boring. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that while we meet today on virtual platform, McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. Montreal as Seen by series is an occasion to welcome on the McGill campus Montrealers like Samantha, who work to contribute in the Montreal community. We want to have a conversation in an informal setting about her work, her ideas, her vision for Montreal. So before we start this conversation, I want to introduce a little bit more about what Samantha does in her work. So Samantha is the Executive Director of Apathy is Boring, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to support and educate youth to become active and contributing citizens in Canadian democracy. Since 2017, she has served on the leadership team of Apathy is Boring, contributing to the strategic development of programs, content, activities through her work as the head of impact and development before transitioning to the executive director role in August 2020. A passionate advocate for democracy and civic engagement, Sam is a respected commentator and educator who believes that the energy, insight, and innovation and innovative spirit of young people are critical to building a stronger and more equitable society for all of us. Sam has worked with countless partners across Canada to support the development of positive engagement practices and provide insight into new understandings that young people bring to change-making, inclusion, and movement building. She is the co-author of Together We Rise, a report which advocates for the adoption of youth-led democratic innovation as a model for expanding our current conception of democratic engagement towards a more holistic understanding of how change happens. Sam is also a proud Montrealer and alumni of Concordia University, where she studied anthropology, specializing in intersection of identity, politics, and community. So we'll start this conversation. So please keep in mind that you are invited to send your question in the Q&A box, and we'll keep monitoring that. So we can always ask your questions, and we'll try to fit them in the questions we're going to ask in the conversation we're going to have. Like I said, this is an informal setting. If you feel to ask your question, and this is not a very formal event, so I hope everyone feels included in the conversation. So we'll start with the first question, which is I already sort of explained what your role is, but I want to give you the chance to explain basically your role at Apathy is Boring and exactly what does the organization do. For those who might not know Apathy is Boring, what does Apathy is Boring do concretely, and if you want to talk more about your role and expand on it.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. And I'm realizing my bio needs to be shorter as you're reading it out loud. Yeah, it's such a pleasure to join all of you today. And I'm always happy to talk about Montreal. I've lived here my whole life, with the exception of a few little stints elsewhere. And it's one of my favorite places in the world. So love the spirit of this event. And I'm excited to be joining. Yeah, so Apathy is Boring. We've been around since 2004. Effectively, we were founded by 3 young people in Montreal who were at a party. They were all students and artists, and basically they were sitting around and talking about, as you do at a party, how concerned they were about youth voter turnout. And so what they decided to do is start a small campaign. They got a small donation for a couple $1,000s. And they started effectively the first youth-led voter engagement campaign directed at youth, for youth, by youth, that we had really had in Canada, and certainly in the digital space. 2004, there was no Facebook, there was no social media. It was very much like, just they started a website and they went out to events and they started chatting with people directly and engaging young people and saying like, hey, why don't you vote? Why don't you turn out? they were massively successful in that endeavor. And then sort of from there, permanent organization was founded. And really the philosophy of our work is to continue to really work from sort of that youth-led perspective and really ensure that whatever work we're doing is aligned with where young people are currently at. So obviously the world has changed a lot since 2004. Our strategies have changed a lot. We focus less sort of specifically now on just voter engagement work. We've really broadened what we do to encompass sort of democratic engagement as a whole, which includes community-based work. It also includes activism, includes programming that is local in nature and sort of understanding the unique circumstances of different communities across Canada, including Montreal. So that's what we do. In my role, I'm very fortunate enough to get to sort of be a part of a lot of the different initiatives that we do and sort of oversee our alignment with our mission, which is my primary sort of mandate, and make sure that all of our work is moving forward and the impact that we want to be having. And so that includes our communications, our ongoing programming, like our RISE programs and our BUILD program, which I can explain maybe a little bit more after. Maybe I'll leave it there. Okay, go on.
Thank you. I forgot to mention at the beginning that I'll be co-animating this series with Professor Bélanger. So Professor Bélanger is with us, so we'll be alternating the questions we ask. And so I forgot to mention that earlier. Yeah, so thank you for that introduction, Samantha. So I'm going to give you another question, which is basically at the core what Apathy is Boring does as work is, what is, in your opinion, the primary reason for youth apathy in the electoral process?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big question. I think that, so from what we see and sort of on the research side, when we talk about non-voters or people who don't vote, there tend to be sort of two primary sort of sets of barriers that they face. It can either be motivational in nature or sort of access-based. So depending on your lived experience and sort of how you're coming into elections, you can kind of fall into either. When it comes to youth, the youth demographic sort of more generally, and we're talking like 18 to 24 and 25 to 34 kind of being the categories or the age ranges that we're looking at. The primary barriers that young people face are motivational. So if you ask someone why they don't vote, it'll be things along the lines of, like all politicians are the same, or they don't care about me, or, like my vote doesn't matter, it won't make an impact. And because it tends to be more motivational in nature, what we have, or the way that we sort of work is the access barriers, things like I can't physically enter my polling station, for example, or I can't get off work, or some of these, I don't have childcare. These things are kind of more structural in nature and require a more institutional structural response. But when we think about motivational, we're actually thinking about like, how do we shift the attitudes of young people in order to overcome these barriers? And that's where sort of it takes a lot of nuance and a lot of sort of broad reach, but also like in-depth intervention to sort of, especially if you're talking about a young person who also comes from a marginalized community or has a lived experience that creates distance or blocks when it comes to engaging with institutions. It's really important that you sort of there's no silver bullet. You really have to sort of have a number of strategies to sort of start to tackle those barriers.
Thank you.
Can I ask a subsidiary question?
Yeah.
I was wondering, what is the extent of your relationships with Directeur Général des Élections au Québec or in other provinces or at the federal level? Is there, because I know they are also very concerned with this issue of youth apathy. So do you have, what sort of links do you have with them, and what sort of discussions and looking out for possible solutions, perhaps?
Yeah, and that's it, right? It's kind of that pairing of that institutional element with the sort of more civil society youth cultural focused lens. We work a lot directly with Elections Canada, for example. We're not currently working with Elections Quebec, but we would love to. We're open to working with all provincial electoral management bodies. But typically the line that's kind of been drawn or had been drawn in the past, I think it's a little bit different now within the the Canada Elections Act itself, but the line that has sort of been drawn was they can do everything up until asking someone to vote. So they focus on where, when, ways to vote. They focus on getting that information out in really clear and accessible ways through different formats. They create, their goal, and as it should be, is to be the trusted source for information around elections, and their integrity and their nonpartisanship and all of that is so important to us having trust in our democracy. If you think about the ways that in the States, for example, the partisan elements of how elections are managed on a really structural level, you have like state legislatures running the elections, the electoral management bodies as part of the government. So we have sort of an arm's length system here that allows for that to be really trusted. So that integrity is really important. So where we kind of come in over and above that is we have the relevancy and the reach and the trusted relationships with young people through our programming, through our communications, through all of that we're able to distribute that in a really good way and take that additional step of being like, and we're asking you to vote. And we're saying that your participation is important in the system and we want you to show up, which is kind of an additional step to what up until I think the last election, like Elections Canada, for example, was able to do just based on the legislation. And I think that extra step is really important because we underestimate a lot of young people aren't asked to vote. No one tells them like, hey, we think your voice matters in this process. And so if that is a barrier and that can push someone over the line from like thinking like, elections, whatever, doesn't really matter, to saying like, you know what, actually, I do want to show up and I do want to have my voice heard. That's sort of the balance, I guess, of how we work with those bodies specifically.
Okay, so yes, super interesting. So if I understand you correctly, so you do have some relationship with them, but your role is more complementary to theirs.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Good.
And I see there's a question just in terms of how I'm using the word youth and young people, which is really important. So I'm just going to clarify. We work with voting age youth. That's how we frame it. So 18 and over, the primary range being 18 to 30. But when it comes to our elections work, just because of the nature of how the categories are kind of defined, it goes up to about 34.
So I think we're talking about Elections Canada. So I think I'll continue on that topic. In the last election, we did saw that Election Canada was not able to implement on-campus voting, which was a major thing in the last two elections. But in the current, in the last one, they were unable to do it. That's one initiative that goes. But do you think there's other initiatives that Election Canada can undertake that can be studied that can further increase youth participation, like I don't know, online voting or universal mail-in ballots or something that you think that needs to be implemented that is not there yet that could further increase youth participation?
So I've had conversations with Elections Canada about online voting, and I don't think that's happening anytime soon, just with what we're seeing sort of internationally around election integrity and that kind of thing. I don't think that there's a sense that would be the best way forward. Right now, their whole thing is like, it's all paper ballots and they're counted by hand. So there's not even ballot counting machines. Like, so it's very, I don't think that's coming anytime soon. And again, if we're talking about motivational barriers, we're talking about, for the most part, people feeling like it's not just about the election. They can get the information if they're sufficiently motivated on where to vote. There are polling stations located in a lot of places. The on-campus polling stations are great, especially for students who are living away from home, because you're able to vote in your home riding. Do I think that's what makes or breaks youth participation? Like, no, I don't. You can also go to your, it's convenient, and it's really good at being complementary to on-campus get out the vote initiatives. Like, you can be like, hey, just go vote right now. Like that, I think that's great. And I think that probably does make a difference for some people. But I think if we're talking about these motivational things, we're talking about really systemic things like civic education being very, very limited in a lot of places in Canada in terms of like how our system actually works. We're talking about the network of disinformation that might make someone exacerbate some of these motivational barriers, like feeling like your vote doesn't matter, like feeling all politicians are the same or no one represents you, or all these things. These things can be exacerbated by disinformation campaigns, whether they're coordinated or not. And so I think in terms of the structural pieces, there's always going to be things that they can improve on. I think bringing back on-campus polling stations the next election makes a lot of sense to me. I understand why they didn't do it in this last election as well. Just given everything else that was going on with the pandemic, the timing of the election would have meant that the on-campus polling stations would have had to be there like the first couple of days of school, because they don't happen synchronously to like advanced polling or election day. They actually come in a few weeks before. So there's a few things there. I think mail-in ballots are great. I think they're convenient. Again, they help get over this barrier of if you're a young person and you move a lot, that can be a barrier if you don't actually know where you're registered or you don't get your voter information card or whatever the case may be. Yeah, I see there's a question. I don't know, I'm not the moderator, but anyways, I'm happy to.
Well, there's a question in the chat and there's a hand raised. So I think the question in the chat came first. So it was by Patrick Bisson. Do you consider the loss of campus voting at the last federal election hurt student turnout?
I don't have a data-driven answer for that, so I could speculate. I think maybe in some cases, but I also think it's difficult to compare if you think about, again, the election timing. Like, it was very early in the semester. So again, if there had been which Elections Canada can't control, right? Like, that's the elections called by the Prime Minister, and that's the time frame they're working in. So the timing might have also hurt student turnout, despite the fact that there weren't on campus, even if there had been, on campus polling. Mail-in ballots were an alternative. I actually can't answer that question like in a way that I feel confident about. I think it's possible for some people, but would it have made the difference? Like at the end of the day in turnout overall? Like, no, I don't actually think so.
All right. I think Samuel had his hand up, so you can feel free to raise the hand if you want to ask directly a question. So Samuel, can go.
Yes, hello. So first of all, thank you for your job. Find it super interesting. I applied when I was doing my Excel placement. It was one of the two places that I wanted to go. But my question to you is, so I come from Belgium, where voting is mandatory. And in municipal elections, every resident in Belgium can vote. And I think it's a really good thing, because here I am for minimum 4 years in Canada. I was super interested in the municipal election, and I couldn't vote. I couldn't do anything. So I talked to a lot of my friends who are Canadians who could vote, and they didn't. And so my question to you is, do you think that one, mandatory voting is a good thing? And two, should the residents of Canada vote in municipal elections?
Those are such great questions, Samuel. Yeah, so on the first point on mandatory voting, so I think there's a couple of things there. I think mandatory voting without like a sort of a complementary civics education and support for people who, and so I'm talking like that could start at the high school level, right? Like you could have the same conversation around like lowering the voting age and all this. There have to be structural educational pieces and support, I think, to make that policy meaningful towards actually pushing democratic engagement. Because just forcing people and then penalizing them on their taxes or whatever, like some people will just be like, cool, I'll just pay the $100 or whatever you're going to tack on to my tax bill. So I think we also have to be looking at, again, those motivational factors that make people turn out. But the good argument that I've heard for this, and I will name it here just as kind of like a counterpoint to that, is that what mandatory voting could potentially shift is the way politicians look at who their voting constituencies are. So if you think about one of the issues that we have right now with this sort of motivational piece of young people feeling like politicians don't care about them. Well, when you're running a campaign and you're looking at limited resources and you're like, well, young people turn out in fewer numbers than older people, it changes the way you gear your policy, what kind of policies you come out with, how you look at, you know, who's your voting base and it's all about just getting out the vote. It's the numbers, right? Which makes sense from a campaign standpoint, but from a democracy standpoint, you're leaving a lot of votes on the table that you could be going out and engaging with. So that's the best argument I ever heard for mandatory voting, was it forces the politicians to assume that everyone's going to vote. And that might reorient how they engage with their constituencies, et cetera. So I think that piece is really interesting and potentially test it, I guess. But like, do I think that's something that we're going to implement in Canada anytime soon? Like, maybe not, but it's definitely an interesting proposal. On the side of municipal elections and residents, I mean, I think that that's a really interesting idea. I'm not sure how that works but I guess if you're paying taxes, like there is a real conversation to have there philosophically about who should be participating in making decisions if you live in a place for long enough, or if you're a permanent resident, or how you look at that. And I know that there are some cities like London, I believe, is also like that, where you can vote in like the London election if you've lived there for a certain amount of time, or if you have an address. And from a democracy standpoint, it's worth having that conversation around, like, should it just be residents? Should it, like, there's always a definition of how we define a citizen, right? And that I think is sort of part functional and part philosophical, and it's worth like considering. I don't have an answer as to like whether or not we should here. I just think it's a really interesting like conversation to open, and one that we probably should, again, from a democracy standpoint, to really be clear on like who we're counting. Because I think it's the same thing around, like I said, lowering the voting age to 16, right? That's a conversation worth having. Like 16-year-olds can work, they pay taxes, they're undergoing civic education. Having them vote in high school might lead to better turnout long-term. There's lots of good arguments for why that should be a thing. And I think making sure that we're consistently revising who we see as citizens. I mean, women might not have the right to vote, right, if we didn't revise these ideas. So I think that's just part of living in a democracy, that we should always be checking ourselves on how we view these things. Sorry, that was kind of long-winded, but very passionate about these things.
No, but it was super interesting. Thank you.
And I think the current administration in Montreal was open to the idea of expanding vote to permanent residents in the city. But of course, you need that change to come from the provincial government. And so that's another level of government that has to agree to it. But there was openness from the city government that it should be able to expand to permanent residents. So these are conversations that are ongoing. And the lowering the voting age too. There was I think the new mayor of Longueuil raised it when she was a member of the National Assembly. So these are questions that always come around. So it's actually interesting to talk about how we define suffrage, and it's ever expanding, and how it should be expanded further in the new age.
So far as your organization has been able to assess, do you notice a clear difference in the youth attitudes vis-a-vis voting and elections at the municipal level as opposed to provincial or federal? Or is it all the same?
I mean, turnout tends to, which is so interesting to me, turnout tends to be lower in municipal elections, and your municipal government sort of has the most impact on your day-to-day life, right? Like you think about like, you know, when your garbage gets picked up, or like whether or not you have a bike path on your street, or it's very much the space and the place that you live in and occupy at any given time. So it's really fascinating to me that is the case. I have my theories. I don't know if it's that like the way that I can speak specifically about Montreal. So both my parents, just for a bit of context, were broadcasters in Montreal for a long time on the English side. And so I've sort of watched quite intimately over the last like 20 years or so how the local media coverage has shrunk. Like if you look at like even just the physical size of the Montreal Gazette, for people who remember, like it used to be a pretty decent thick newspaper. It's like sort of anemic now. And you look at like local broadcast coverage, so much is coming centrally out of Toronto or out of, you know, I mean, I think even last year, the CTV removed the only English language correspondent that was covering Quebec City at some point during a pandemic. Like that's kind of crazy. Like we should probably talk about like what's happening there. And I wonder at times if the lack of local coverage that is sustained and if that impacts the way people feel about their local governments, and how they understand what's happening there and how they feel connected to them. Again, that's just a theory from my perspective because I've kind of been watching this for a long time. But yeah, I think that I stand by the idea that young people, I've never met a young person that doesn't care about anything. And I know a lot of young people care very deeply about things that are happening in our cities. You talk about policing, you talk about local environmental initiatives. All of these things are really, really, really important. And there's something that's not connecting there. And I don't know if it's because they're not feeling engaged by the process, or if it's because, again, there's just this like narrative, sort of broader narrative of how they connect to that local government that's not happening. But yeah, there's a cultural element to this. And I think it's worth exploring, like, well, we do, like how we can try and connect people locally. Our current community-based program, our RISE program, we have a hub in Montreal. And so we gather about 7 or 8 youth together for a 20-week program. We give them a budget and they design a local community initiative, and we take them through a curriculum where they learn about budgeting and community consultations and connect them with sort of people locally in the network. And our current theme is resilient cities. So they are really focused on city building and getting involved in the municipal level. And I do think that initiatives like that can help make that connection, but those are deep interventions that don't necessarily have the same reach. And I think we need to be thinking about like how we reach more people, which is why I bring the media, but I think there's other ways as well.
I'm going to sort of jump on what you just said about sort of this incoherence between, well, basically there's this lazy stereotype about young people being cynical and disengaged with the system. And they point to like, they don't vote. But on the other hand, we see that our generation is very passionate about a lot of issues. We see them with the climate march, the global climate strikes, social media activism, and they're still very vocal about our issues. So how do we explain the sort of incoherence and low participation in the electoral process, but still high level of activism? Does the blame lie with electoral politics? And then I think you can answer a second question that jumps into then, what responsibility do the people in the electoral process, like political parties, elected officials, have in trying to fix this? If the blame is in the electoral process.
I think, I have so many thoughts on this. Okay, let me organize them. Okay, so I think to start, I think it's not a matter of incoherence, it's a matter of perspective. So young people, like you said, and I think we can all see this, are so passionate. Like I like to talk, and this is a good Montreal example. I often end up giving this and people kind of like, what? But I grew up in St. Lazare, just off the island, and I've lived in Montreal in the city for about 15 years. And I think about growing up. So out where I grew up, you need to have a driver's license to go anywhere. And so all my friends saved up money, bought cars, got their driver's licenses, whatever. So we're talking about like 16, 17-year-old, like teenage guys, who are not particularly engaged by much. But I'm telling you, the second they got cars, those guys were obsessed with infrastructure. It was like roads and potholes and cost of this and they could give you like a 10-point budget plan on how to fix the roads and like who's doing what wrong and corruption and all of these things. And so it's like, it's a matter of perspective, how you look at like that. Those are 17-year-old kids, guys that are interested in infrastructure and roads. And like, that's not a particularly generally like a sexy kind of topic or issue, but like they were really engaged by it. So I think that we have to, first of all, like think about how we look at political engagement and what that looks like in interest and passion. But I think on the other side, we're not measuring engagement correctly if we only look at things like voter turnout. And I think that can be really challenging in an academic context, because it's like, how do we measure dynamic spaces and what does that look like? And that's a lot of the work that we've done, is sort of trying to reframe a little bit, not trying to come up with these fixed indicators, but being okay with sort of the transience, I guess, of youth culture. So we look sort of more at these general areas. There are degrees of, like, institutional engagement is very important. Institutions shift policy, they shift systems and conditions, and those matter. But we also have to talk about how young people engage in activism, and we also have to talk about how young people engage in community development and that work. And all of those pieces are part of our democracy because they all sort of intersect and influence one another. But I think further to that, like, we have to think about individual young people's personal theory of change. Not everyone wants to go work in an institution. Not everyone feels comfortable or feels like that's the best use of their time. And when we think about how this all intersects with youth turnout, young people who are passionate will invest their time in something that they think will yield results. And so when we think about what politicians and what political parties and what all of these sort of people could be doing to engage young people, show them that their vote matters. Show them that you're doing something different. Be accountable to those young people. Don't just show up during an election cycle. Think about developing relationships with your constituents. Show them that there are distinctions between different, political parties or candidates. And I think that that's something that's lacking. And when young people don't feel like their voice is heard in that process, they're going to find other ways to have their ideas come forward. And that might be more activism based. That might be more community driven or grassroots. But I think in an ideal world, what we want to do is make sure that young people have an assortment of tools in their tool belt, or I guess their civic tool belt or whatever. So that, like, yes, you're voting and you're engaging in activism and you're working at the grassroots, and whatever way you think is the best way to drive your ideas forward, you're able to do that. And so that deficit of civic education and that deficit of confidence or sense of belonging within our political structures sort of yields this like feeling like, oh, well, it's not worth my time, even though voting takes 7 minutes on average, not in the last election. It took me 90 minutes to vote in the last election, but typically it takes like 7 minutes to do. Sorry, again, long-winded, but lots of thoughts.
That's great. That's why we are here, to hear your thoughts. So I know there's two hands. I'm not sure if Samuel, that's an old hand, or do you have a new question? Yeah, all right, perfect. So there's Samuel, and there's Daniel. All right, so Samuel, you can go.
May I? Okay. Pretty straightforward. Do you think that politicians in municipal and regional and even federal context, do they have incentive to bring youth people in the polls? Like, because they're here for so long, and maybe that will bring a change that they don't want.
Yeah, that's a very valid question to ask. And I think that we should all be holding, or I certainly will in my work, I'll be holding our elected representatives and the parties and all of that to a standard of we should all be advocating for democracy. And this is like a question of democracy. It's the long-term viability of our democracy. If young people are voting in fewer numbers, like, and that trend continues to decline, you're looking at a point where a very small percentage of the population is deciding, for everyone, and who is disproportionately underrepresented. Disproportionately, that might be whatever. You know what I mean? Like, who's underrepresented in that process? Who's making those decisions? And I think that take that to an extreme, and you're in a pretty bad situation for democracy. So yes, I think there are some, and I think that's an incredibly, like, on their part, not on your part for asking the question, like an incredibly cynical approach to democracy. And I very much have an issue with it.
The next question comes from Daniel. You can ask your question.
Hi, Daniel.
Hello, Samantha. How are you?
I'm well, thanks.
So I have two questions. First, I wanted to talk about sort of your relationship with marginalized communities, but I had another question later on. If the conversation moves past elections, I wanted to ask something else later, so I'll raise my hand later as well. So my first question is, you talked about building trusted relationships with the youth, and I'm curious about your relationship with marginalized people. Do those marginalized groups typically approach your organization, or do you approach them? And if so, what is sort of the racial breakdown of the young people that you are engaged with? And how diverse is it really? And how is the campaign that you do with with these young groups?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question, Daniel. So I'm a very poor representation of the diversity of our staff team. Just so our leadership team, our staff are incredibly diverse. So I think that comes from building relationships with partners, with our participants. I think if you're looking for an actual number, the last I checked, I think about at least 80% of our program participants and people that we recruit to our programs especially come from marginalized backgrounds. So whether that's like racialized communities or Indigenous communities, LGBTQ plus communities, disability communities, like we do a great job, I think, because we have so much diversity within our staff, and because that's definitely a priority, that we're able to sort of build those connections with youth in community. And then from there, it's about like really sustaining and building these networks. So connecting these youth to one another and then building that trust, and then we have an amazing referral rate for program participants. So we build trust with youth, and then their friends end up joining. And I think we're doing a really excellent job of engaging young people, building trust, and then from there, supporting them even longer term. We've had participants become staff members who've become one of our Montreal Rise coordinator works at McGill now as well. And like, she's still running programming and sending us back people. And we just have put a lot of energy into building relationships and sustaining those relationships and being accountable to those relationships. And I think that's sort of the root of it. If you're talking about those deeper interventions, it's not about like surface, like, oh, wow, we reached like 200,000 people on this Instagram post. Like, yes. And there also needs to be a complementary component of making sure that we're creating a legacy of like long-term. You know what my dream is? To sunset the organization and not be needed anymore. If there are enough young people doing this work long-term, then that's the dream, right? To work yourself out of a job and not be required anymore. And so if we're investing in communities and in a diversity of communities and youth who are disproportionately affected by these systems and these institutions, and we're able to do that well, are we still needed in 20 years? Like, I hope not. And that's the idea, is that there's sort of it's about building a movement of young people who are able to sort of create initiatives locally that address the specific needs of their communities and the people that they know. And did that answer your question, Daniel?
Somewhat. I was also curious about sort of how do the young people come to you ever for help? If say they're going through situations and they need your help for anything, do they come to you, or do you fully 100% go to them? And if it's the other way around where you go to them, typically how is that done? How is what is your thought process when you target these groups, and where do you find these people? Where do you go after them?
So we have a very strong like communications strategy. We have a really strong online presence. So like, we definitely have a lot of people that come to us there and discover us through Instagram or whatever. And I think that's really important, because it's a pretty low risk entry point, right? It's like, okay, you just follow someone on social media, but they're able to learn a bit about us, about our approach, about who we are, the types of people that work at the organization, that participate in programs, all that good stuff. So I think there's a degree of people coming to us in that respect, but we also do intentional outreach. We have a permanent full-time outreach coordinator whose job it is to develop those relationships with different organizations and to sort of strategically, and that's within our communications team, sort of strategically think about like, hey, who are we not reaching right now and why? And how do we go about building those relationships so that we can provide, whether that's support, like zooming out for a second, one of the things that we do during elections is we were the co-founders of the Canadian Vote Coalition, along with a group at Ryerson. And basically what we did was say, hey, there's no way that as an organization of 30 people, whatever, we're going to reach every person in Canada that needs this information. So what we did through that network was we actually shared best practices on voter engagement work. And we shared materials with community-based organizations that are already working within their networks. So they do different work other than voter mobilization, but their networks might be people who are missed by sort of the political machinery or whatever, but that might be in their interest to have that information. So we worked with about 700 organizations across Canada, and we distributed and shared information with them so that they could reach. I don't think we're always the best vehicle for everything. And I think if we can share our best practices and skills and whatever with someone who can make use of that, then I think that that's another way that we're able to reach our long-term vision, if that makes sense. So I think it's a little bit of both, to answer your question.
Yeah, that actually, it's funny that was going to follow up what I was going to ask you later, but that's interesting. So you said that you sort of offer information, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so so on the website, it says that you specifically offer resources for anti-Black racism, and that you work with or you have a list of organizations that work to combat this issue. So I'm wondering, in what ways other than information do you guys partner with these organizations, and what kind of support? Is it financial support that you provide, or what kind of liaisons do you have with these local groups?
Yeah, so it would depend on the nature of the relationship, right? Sometimes it might be providing resources or a workshop. Sometimes it might be if we're asking, so say we want support in terms of like EDI support, or we want to what's the word I'm looking for? Like we're asking an organization or a partner to give a workshop to us or whatever, then the nature would be financial. So it really depends on what the nature of the relationship is. We do try to be quite intentional about where we spend our money and who we work with. So in that respect, like that would, like, especially from a financial standpoint. But yeah, we do a lot of different initiatives. So I don't know specifically what you're looking at, but it is, yeah, there's lots of different ways. It could also be us saying like, hey, like, we think that, you know, this program or this information might be interesting for the people that you work with, and that can be like reciprocal in nature. But yeah, it depends on the specific situation.
All right. Thank you for those questions, Daniel. They were very pertinent, and I think it brought the conversation to another level, which I think was very important. I think you talked about social media, so I'll touch on that a little bit, because there's a lot of talks about social media and its role in the democratic process. There's been more focus on the negatives of social media and how it can spread disinformation and even hate, and how it's increasingly becoming a thorn in the side of the democratic process. But other views as a positive development, like I said, your organization uses, a lot of young people use it. It's like a forum for new activism that is a sort of emerging to and developing. So what is your view on social media? Like, do the positive outweigh the negative, or is there some, like, how do you fit social media into it's a new tool in the democratic process, and how it can help youth participation?
I don't think I have a positive or negative view of social media, and I will explain myself. Like, I think that there are very scary, very bad elements of social media that we need to be talking about, and it's overdue. And I mean, it's one thing here. I think there's a lot of what we've been learning specifically about Facebook, right? But Facebook is just a placeholder for, like, it's the social media infrastructure that we've created, right? It's unprecedented. We keep trying, I think, I was talking about this the other day with a friend. I think we keep trying to fit Facebook or Twitter or whatever, Google, into these old frameworks of communication. Oh, they're broadcasters, right? They're just like a network. It's not. It's a completely new thing that we've invented. We don't really quite understand the multitude of ways that it's impacting people in the real world, engaging in a digital space. But at the same time, it's not going anywhere. We've clearly committed to this. We've developed, it's like, it would be like going back and being like, oh, you know what, the printing press, like, not so sure about that. It's done. It's happened. We're here. So I view it neutrally, in the sense that, like, I'm like, okay, we need to get this under control, particularly in countries where they're not being given, so the global South, like non-Western countries, where they're not being given the same resources and support that Facebook or whoever is giving here. And I think there have been quite a few stories in the last little while that have come out that have demonstrated that. Obviously Myanmar, where people are quite literally being killed, and Ethiopia as well, being two like examples that stand out to me. I'm sure I'm missing some as well, but so I think the potential for propaganda and for harm to our democracy. I read yesterday that I forget which index it was. There's an index that actually said that the US is a backsliding democracy. That's terrifying. That's terrifying. Like, and that, many of us are now living in democracies that are backsliding. For me, like, I'm like, the point is past. There's got to be, and even Facebook, right? When all these papers and stuff come out, at least in the Canadian context, they are openly being like, please regulate us. And I think we're in a position where maybe our legislators don't even quite understand what we're dealing with, and maybe we don't in general. But yeah, so I think there's an incredible potential for like the democratization of information, the way that, marginalized voices are able to speak out in ways that they were blocked by institutions in the past. I think all of those things are really important. And I think that like, we have a problem, like we have a serious problem, and Facebook can blame users and users can blame Facebook, and we could talk about advertising, we talk about all these things, but I think we need to get past this idea that we're living in this is just like the next step of like television. Like, it's not. This is a completely new thing, and anyone can have a voice, and anyone can pay money and have their, the reach that they want on information that's untrue or sows division or creates hate, or manifests hate, I guess, or perpetuates it. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of like, no, it's just the infrastructure now, and how we use it and how we regulate and how we understand it is, I think, crucial at this moment for us figuring out how we're going to fix this problem, how we're going to deal with. I'm sure everyone knows someone. I think about this, like I ask people a lot, actually. I think everyone knows someone who's succumbed or been, subjected to conspiracy theories and disinformation. Like, my aunt sent me a video during COVID of like, just like, it's like, where did you get this? This is just a guy speaking Italian in a lab coat. Like, what are you talking about? Like, very early on. And she was like, oh, like, that's why I sent it to you. I wanted to know if it was real. I was like, in what world was this real? Like my aunt is Brazilian. And so like the WhatsApp situation is kind of intense in that part of the world. And like, she just forwarded me something someone had forwarded her in some massive group chat. And I was like, this is terrifying. Where are you getting this? So yeah, all that to say is that I think if each of us knows someone who's been in that situation, that's not even, sorry, that's my like funny example. I know many not funny examples. Then we have a really big problem. And I think we really need tools also as individuals to take on, the people in our backyard and our people and be like, and how do you actually unpack that with someone in a way that's meaningful rather than just like further entrenching them into their positions? So lots of thoughts, but anyways, that's kind of my, yeah.
Well, thank you. I think I think we've all been on the other end of WhatsApp, a video or message being sent to us. I've dealt with a lot of my mother's messages coming via WhatsApp, so much that I've just got rid of WhatsApp. That's just an app that I don't use anymore because of that. So yes, but it's a great insight into it, and we definitely about the role of social media, and I think it's going to become more relevant as the issue becomes more problematic. So I think I have another 2 questions. I think it was Samuel again who raised his hand first. So if you want to go, you can ask your question.
Yes, so just to add up on that, I invite you all to watch the documentary on Netflix called The Great Hack. So it's about Trump election and the Brexit, and how data analysis like control all of the voters. And yeah, nowadays in campaign elections, the most important battleground it's on social media. And the big problem, I think, it's that these GAFA, these big companies, they're not accountable to us. So they can basically do whatever they want. A year ago, 2 years ago, Mark Zuckerberg was at the European Parliament, and we could see that he was lying like in front of all the MPs, but what can we do about it? He doesn't pay tax there and he doesn't do anything. So I think it will be one of the most important matter in the following years. And I invite you all to watch this documentary, maybe with your interest. I'll write it in the chat.
It's a very good documentary. That's a really good recommendation.
Thank you. And Daniel, you had a question too.
Yes. So talking again about your organization, because I'm fascinated about that. So first, curious about what funding do you receive for your organization, as well as how you sort of train your staff on dealing with these sensitive groups that need particular attention and need particular ways of talking, so they're not provoked or so they feel comfortable. So wondering about both those things.
Yeah, totally. So our funding, on one hand, a lot of our funding, like lots of nonprofits, comes from public financing, so government grants, that kind of thing. We also do have some individual donors or smaller foundations that we work with, but the current government has placed a really high priority, especially at the federal level, on youth engagement and youth work. So we've been pretty fortunate in that respect to have a few grants that we draw from there. And in terms of our training and our staff, our approach, I guess, is a staff team. So as I said before, I think we make equity hiring a priority as an organization. So again, like making sure that we have really good representation within our staff team from different communities that we work with. But then on top of that, making sure that we're constantly like trying to create an environment where we all sort of understand that we're all learning and that we're all growing, and that there's accountability towards doing that, and making sure that we're undergoing trainings and investing a lot of money in and time and energy in consistently learning, growing, doing. I think a lot of us are quite plugged in online, and by nature of our personalities are also just continuously doing the work ourselves to make sure that we're creating safer spaces, braver spaces that we can show up, and also support the learning of the youth that we're working with, right? Because everyone comes in at different stages in their learning journey, as we're fond of saying. And so making sure that we're also creating space for people to learn. And yeah, just continuously be doing that work as individuals as well as collectively.
I meant more so like if you have a conversation one-on-one with somebody in a marginalized community, how does your sort of strategy change when you're talking to them? Like, say, for example, you don't want to enforce your point of view on that person, like you mentioned. You don't want them to be anchored per se in their point of view. You want to maybe convince them of something else. How do you go about that process? How do you go about sort of convincing of them of your point of view as an organization without being like a domineering presence?
That's a good question. I think that I can speak for myself in the way that, so I think a really good example of this, just to kind of root it in something, is around voter engagement work, right? So for example, when you're talking about whether or not someone votes or why they don't vote or do vote, I think the strategy or the approach that I tend to take is sort of anchored in just trying to understand, first of all, what the issue is. If someone tells me, like, I think specifically of sort of Indigenous communities, when you're talking about democracy and voting in the Canadian context, like that is a highly individual, community-based, like there are layers to how someone perceives, participating in elections. So understanding where someone's coming from, and also just being okay with, especially me as a settler, as a non-Indigenous person, to not assume that my way is better than their way or anything else. Like, so I always just try and root it in understanding, and then share my perspective and leave it at that. There's not a specific ask in that context, because I can't know the lived experience of that person that I'm speaking to specifically. So I think it's a matter of saying, like, okay, it's cool. It's also just cool. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to not have the same approach. It's okay. Like, plurality and all of these things within our democracy is really important. And I don't actually think that my opinion is the most important in any conversation, and certainly not in one where I might not have the same perspective as someone else. So that would be, I think, a strategy that I could name, but also just as sort of generally as a person, how I tend to approach these conversations, which is to just create space for understanding and learning and not looking to win the conversation. I think so often we're trying to like win when we talk to people with different opinions. It's not about winning, it's about trying to figure out what the truth is, and sometimes or trying to get it a new perspective or learn. And I think if you shift your objective from winning to learning, then you automatically are having a different sort of conversation that's actually building towards potentially having a shared understanding, but also could just be like about learning something new from the person that you're speaking to.
Thank you. So I feel like we're almost running out of time. So I want to ask you a last question. Or like, so do you think that the Quebec youth is represented adequately in the formal political institution and processes such as parliaments, political parties, elections, public administrations? Like, what can you say about Quebec youth and their participation?
I mean, I think if you were to look at it like from a demographic standpoint, like no, I think that's clear. That's a lot of, I think as a culture, we tend to look at things only along like sort of this axis of inexperience to experience. And we really value experience in a lot of ways, right? So we look at, I'm talking specifically in like the political space. I think in like music, it's probably a little bit different, but like if you're looking at people engaging in decision-making, we tend to say like, okay, experience is the main qualifier. And I think young people internalize that. I think everyone sort of internalizes that. You need to have the experience to implement to be able to make decisions. But what we try and do is sort of reframe that a little bit. Yes, experience is incredibly important, but young people are incredibly innovative and creative and resilient and interested in trying out new things and all of that. And so there's something really beautiful that happens when young people are paired with like, so that creative, innovative spirit of like pushing things forward, which so often is well suited for like activism spaces, for example, which is why young people, I think, are probably overrepresented in that area of democratic engagement, right? But we don't have these two sides talking to each other. So like the potential for democratic innovation and rethinking our systems and policy and all of these things, if you were to actually have this sort of mutually respectful relationship of innovative spirit with experience, I think that's where there's so much potential to really shift our systems and the conditions that we live in, and having those opinions and those lived experience be prioritized, and having a diversity of opinions, thinking about things like universal design and how like a rising tide can really like raise all boats, like shifting a little bit how we think about things, I think that could really be a game changer. So I'm always going to say until we reach that point, then yeah, I think there's a underrepresentation of young people in decision-making positions, certainly. And I think that will take a bigger cultural shift than just a simple like, oh, we elected more young people to the National Assembly. Like, okay, yeah, that's great. We should do that. But we should also be thinking about how those young people are then engaged and in what positions we're putting them in. And yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your answers. I don't know if there was any last question, but if you have any questions, I think you can always contact Samantha at Apathy's Debarring. They're looking on their website, and you can always contact them for more information regarding what they do, Samantha specifically, or other people at the organization, and see what kind of activities they do, what kind of initiatives they have, and if you're interested in it. Again, from the Quebec Studies Student Association, from the Quebec Studies Program Center for Interdisciplinary Research on McGill and McGill Institute for Study of Canada, we thank you for participating in our event. We always have pleasure seeing such high turnout in our events, despite the the fact that Zoom can be tiring and it can be overwhelming at times. We thank you for your participation. And again, again, if you want to get in touch with the Quebec Studies Student Association, you can always contact us on Facebook or contact me or anyone. It's a small program, but it's a program that is great if you want to learn more about Canada, Quebec, Montreal. We have wonderful professors. And the minor too, I'm going to put into propaganda for the Quebec Studies minor. If you're taking a class with Professor Poutanen and QSST, then I think there's a work. You should probably consider going to that minor. It's an excellent place to learn more about Quebec and all that. So again, any questions or comments, you can contact us for the Quebec Studies program. For Apathy's bar, you can contact Samantha. And thank you all for participating. And thank you, Professor Bélanger, for co-hosting this, and all the team, Mr. Gervais, and all of you, and Professor Bélanger for participating. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.
Thank you.